You are Locked On Syracuse, your daily podcast on the Syracuse Orange. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
I know the final score says 31-28 Syracuse, and that means that Syracuse obviously allowed 28 points. But don't let the final score fool you, because Syracuse's defense was much better than what that final score actually indicates. First of all, there was a significant improvement in tackling. I talked about at the end of last week how Syracuse had 19 missed tackles against Ohio, and how that is something that is so astronomically bad that I don't think they can do that again. And to their credit, we have the numbers. They did not even come close to 19 missed tackles. Shout out to Chris Carlson from Syracuse.com. He has the stat. Syracuse had 6 missed tackles the entire game against Georgia Tech. That's it. Less than a third of what they had against Ohio. So major improvement with the tackling. Players were taking better angles. I thought the secondary did a nice job tackling in space. I was in the stands, and the whole time I was saying, tackle, tackle, tackle on defense. And that's exactly what they were doing. Very rarely was like, oh, that was a missed tackle. And yeah, there were some breakdowns. There were some poor angles at times. But for the most part, the tackling was significantly improved. And keep in mind, this was without all ACC linebacker Marlo Wax, who is out for another 5 weeks, given the timetable that Fran Brown sent out last week, which was that it was a 6-week injury for him. One of their best players on defense, they didn't have him. And their tackling improved significantly. Shout out to Derek McDonald, who graded out really well against Georgia Tech. And we're going to get into another reason why the defense was significantly improved. It's going to be about Fadil Diggs. Let's talk about the run defense, all right? Syracuse allowed 250 yards against Ohio. Georgia Tech comes to the Dome, obviously top 25 team in the country, and had averaged over 200 yards on the ground through 2 weeks. One of the best running teams in the ACC, if not the country. And Syracuse held them to less than 120 on the ground. Now, why was that the case? Well, there was one major change in the lineup on defense. Fadil Diggs, the 4-star transfer from Texas A&M, 6'5", 260 pounds. He's a big dude. Well, without Marlo Wax, we saw a number of times where Fadil Diggs would line up as a linebacker. He's normally a defensive end, but he was lining up as a linebacker. So for much of this game, Syracuse was playing a 3-3-5 defense. That means 3 defensive linemen, 3 linebackers, and 5 players in the secondary. Those 3 linebackers, so to speak, were Fadil Diggs, Derek McDonald, who is normally a linebacker, and Justin Barron, who is the star or the rover on the defense. He can kind of do it all. That's the point. What's really important with that is they were able to replace Marlo Wax with someone who was out of position, which meant that the backups like Anwar Sparrow and James Hurd didn't see the field as much. Able to let them develop a little bit more. Time of possession was also a big factor in this game. Syracuse held the ball for 37 minutes compared to Georgia Tech 23 minutes. So if you're not having the ball all that much, you're going to have less plays, right? And finally, another reason why the run defense really improved is because Syracuse did something that I never mentioned on the podcast, but always either implied it or was more like, I just didn't say it, but I thought it in my head. So apologies for not saying it. They got the lead. It sounds obvious, but Syracuse went up 7-0 on the opening drive. They went up 21-7 at one point in this game. They went up 31-14 at one point in this game. Georgia Tech was consistently on their heels. They couldn't get any rhythm. They didn't have the ball all that much and were constantly trailing. So what does that mean? You can't really run the football. The efficiency wasn't good for Georgia Tech either, aside from a couple of runs, right? Like Jamal Haynes only had 3.2 yards per carry. He's the running back for Georgia Tech. Their backup, Anthony Carey, had 1 yard per carry on 5 carries. So 5 carries, 5 yards. Don't get me wrong. The run defense was really good, and the adjustment that they made with Fadil Diggs in the middle worked perfectly. At the same time, the offense was able to help them out by getting the lead, keeping the lead for the most part, and also just controlling the clock, which meant that Georgia Tech could not run the football as much. As far as the pass defense, I thought the secondary was really good up until the final 8 minutes of the game, those final 2 drives for Georgia Tech. And I am going to give the secondary a pass. You can call me optimistic or whatever you want, but here's the deal. Syracuse was playing a prevent defense. I actually turned to someone in the stands when Georgia Tech got the ball down 31-14. And I said, listen, if they go down the field and they score a touchdown, it isn't the end of the world. So long as the defense keeps everyone in front of them, there are no big plays, and therefore time comes off the clock. Now, it wasn't helped by the fact that there was a late hit out of bounds at one point. I don't know if it was really a late hit out of bounds. I kind of disagree with the call, and I can get to it later. But aside from the final 8 minutes, my point is Syracuse's secondary was solid. Georgia Tech had 266 pass yards in the game, a respectable total, but I'd wager a lot of those yards came at the very end when Syracuse was in a prevent defense. So I thought the secondary held up very well. And I mentioned off the top that the tackling with the secondary was also, for the most part, pretty good. I also want to give a shout out to the 4-star true freshman, Marcellus Barnes. It's now 2 games in a row where he is graded out by Pro Football Focus really well in coverage. So Marcellus Barnes, who I said was a pleasant surprise of training camp, he is on his way to being an all-ACC freshman, and maybe even more than that as this season keeps going. So this secondary, I think, looks pretty good, aside from the final 8 minutes of the game when they were in prevent defense. Those are the defense takeaways. The run defense was better, and the main reasoning for that, well, tackling better, right? Fadil Diggs as a linebacker worked really, really well. He had himself a great game. Fadil Diggs. Time of possession was also a factor, and also the fact that Syracuse had the lead. All those factors helped Syracuse stop the run at a much better rate than they did against Ohio. And the pass defense, I just told you, was really good up until the final 8 minutes of the game.